They say the first sound a son of Medusa hears is not his mother's cry, but the grinding of tectonic plates. They are born into a world of unforgiving logic, a world where flesh is a temporary vessel and iron is the only truth. They are taught that sentiment is a flaw, emotion is a chemical weakness, and the only true path to immortality is through the blessed purity of the machine. This is the creed of the Iron Hands, and for 10,000 years they have sought to perfect themselves by purging the weakness of their own humanity. But there is a flaw in their logic, a terrible, paradoxical truth that the chapter denies, yet perpetuates with every hero it seeks to save. They believe they are conquering death, preserving their greatest warriors for an eternity of service. But what if they are not preserving life? What if they are merely perfecting a prison? What if the immortality they offer is a curse far more agonizing than any mortal death? This is not a tale of glory, this is an audit of suffering. We will unseal the full, unredacted chronicle of Brother-Sergeant Kaelen of Clan Raukan. We will witness the life of the man, the death of his body, and the damnation of his soul within the adamantium shell of the Dreadnought designated Ironclad. We will trace his journey from a warrior of perfect logic to a screaming ghost, a journey that spans 3 millennia. And at the end, we will reveal the contents of his final lucid transmission, a single, terrifying question that has been hidden in the deepest data vaults of the Fist of Iron, for it is a question that threatens the very foundation of the Iron Hands Creed. Before we unseal the following record, a reminder: what you are about to witness has been deliberately forgotten. By subscribing, you ensure it is remembered. Before the iron, there was the man. Caylin was never a man of grand passions. He was a creature of discipline and function. As a child on Medusa, he did not look at the storm-racked sky with awe, but with calculation, estimating the vectors of the lightning strikes. When his own arm was crushed during his trials of initiation, he felt not pain, but frustration at the biological failure. The augmetic replacement he received was not a mark of shame, but his first glorious step toward perfection. As a battle brother, he was the embodiment of Clan Raukan's cold fury. He mastered the tactical arts not as a warrior, but as a logician. To him, the battlefield was a grand, complex equation, and his bolter was the instrument used to solve it. He saw his squad mates not through the lens of brotherhood, but as fellow components in a flawless machine of war. He cared for them, yes, but in the way a master artisan cares for his tools, ensuring they were maintained, efficient, and ready for their purpose. He was respected, even admired, for his unwavering resolve and tactical genius. But he was not loved. Love was a flaw in the flesh, a variable he had long since purged from his own internal calculus. His purpose was simple: to serve, to endure, to prove the supremacy of iron over the pathetic frailty of the organic. His humanity was a resource to be expended, not a treasure to be cherished. It was this cold, hard philosophy that would make him a perfect candidate for the chapter's most terrible honor. The summons to war was, for Caylin, a return to normalcy. The agri-world of Veridia II, a planet of endless, swaying wheat fields and automated farming combines, had fallen silent. A Tyrannid splinter fleet, a vanguard of the Great Devourer, had descended upon the world, its shadow smothering all life. For the Imperium, it was the potential loss of a vital food source. For Caylin and the Iron Hands of Clan Raukan, it was an offense against order itself. The Tyrannid was the ultimate expression of the flesh's weakness, chaotic, ravenous, and devoid of logic. It was a biological plague that had to be purged with the cold certainty of iron and fire. The mission briefing was a model of efficiency. Caylin stood with his Terminator squad in the strategium of the strike cruiser Iron Will, the holographic display painting Veridia II in stark tactical runes. The objective was clear: decapitate the swarm. A deep strike assault, led by the chapter's veterans in Terminator armor, would punch through the heart of the Tyrannid infestation and destroy the primary Norn emissary, the synaptic creature that served as the swarm's mind and will. It was a classic decapitation strike, a logical solution to a biological problem. Caylin saw the elegant simplicity of the plan and approved. There was no fear, no doubt. There was only the equation of war, waiting to be solved. Inside the vibrating hull of the Stormraven, Caylin performed the final litanies of activation. His squad, 5 brothers encased in walking tanks of ceramite, sat immobile, their systems linked for the coming slaughter. He did not offer words of encouragement, he issued commands. Brother Valdorn, confirm target link to my HUD. Brother Titus, cycle promethium injectors. We are the iron fist of Medusa. We do not bend, we do not break. We endure. His voice over the vox was flat, a monotone of absolute confidence. The descent was a controlled inferno. The gunship bucked and shuddered as it plunged through the spore-choked atmosphere of the dying world. Below them, the once golden fields of Veridia were now a pulsating purple carpet of alien flesh. The air was thick with winged bioforms, and the Stormraven's hurricane bolters roared in response, clearing a path. Then, the assault ramp slammed down, and they were in hell. The initial assault was a testament to the Iron Hand's doctrine. It was a slaughter. The Terminators were a wall of walking iron, their storm bolters scything through waves of hormagaunts and termagants. Caylin was at the heart of the formation, a nexus of cold command. His mind was a whirlwind of tactical data, tracking enemy movements, assigning firing arcs, and identifying priority targets. Valdorn, suppress the left flank. Titus, purge that biospore chimney, advance by fire and maneuver, let no weakness corrupt your fury. They were unstoppable. A tide of steel against a tide of flesh, and steel was winning. They pushed deeper into the pulsating heart of the swarm, the ground becoming a slippery carpet of alien ichor and dismembered limbs. The air, thick with the smell of ozone and burnt alien flesh, was a testament to their progress. Caylin felt a cold flicker of what a lesser man might call satisfaction. The logic held. The equation was being solved. But the swarm was not an army, it was a single, vast organism, and when wounded, it did not rout. It adapted. It learned. From the heart of the writhing mass of bodies, a new variable was introduced into the equation. A carnifex. It was not a creature, it was a biological siege engine, a mountain of armored chitin and scything talons, its roar a physical shockwave of pure biological rage. It cared nothing for tactics or firing lanes. It was a living battering ram, and it was aimed directly at the heart of their formation. Caylin saw the threat immediately. Concentrate fire on the alpha beast. Valdorn, melter charge. Break it before it breaks us. Storm bolter shells, rounds the size of a man's fist, detonated against its hide, tearing away chunks of armor but doing little to slow its apocalyptic charge. It trampled its own kind, its immense legs crushing smaller bioforms underfoot as it thundered towards them. Brother Valdorn stepped forward, his melter gun glowing with white-hot energy, but he was too slow. A scything talon, moving with impossible speed for a creature of its size, caught him in the chest, tearing through his Terminator armor and the man within as if they were paper. The line faltered. Caylin's logic screamed that this was a losing engagement, but retreat was not in his calculus. He was the anchor. He was the iron. Hold the line, he roared, stepping forward to meet the charge, his power fist crackling, his ancient Terminator plate, the legacy of heroes before him, bracing for an impact that would decide the fate of this battle. It was a contest of wills. The cold, unyielding logic of the machine against the ravenous, chaotic hunger of the flesh. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the flesh is always, always hungry. The impact was not a collision. It was a geological event. Tons of enraged tyrannid muscle met unyielding ceramite in a detonation of kinetic force that threw the lesser bioforms in the vicinity from their feet. Caylin's Terminator armor, a relic that had weathered orbital bombardments, held. The servos in his legs screamed as they braced against the strain, his feet sinking deep into the blood-soaked soil. For a moment, there was a stalemate. The Carnifex's immense, scything talons, each the size of a man, scraped and screeched against his pauldrons, carving deep furrows into the sacred iron but failing to find purchase. Kaylin raised his power fist, the disruption field thrumming with contained lightning, and drove it deep into the creature's shoulder joint. There was a wet, explosive crack as the joint shattered. The monster roared, a sound of pure agony and rage that was felt more than heard. It thrashed, its immense weight threatening to overwhelm him. But Kaylin's logic was absolute. He had found a weakness. He pushed forward, intending to drive his fist through the creature's torso and silence its foul heart. He was a machine of death, focused on a single, logical objective. And in that moment of pure, cold focus, he failed to account for the illogical, chaotic nature of the swarm. He saw the primary threat, but not the hidden one. It was a detail lost in the maelstrom of battle. A parasitic symbiote, nestled within the Carnifex's armored chest cavity, now lunged forth. It was a blur of speed, a living spear of chitin and malice. Before Kaylin's threat analysis runes could even register it as a secondary target, its bladed head struck the one vulnerable point his armor presented in that stance. The gorget, the armored collar protecting his neck. The ceramite, thick as a fortress wall, cracked. The bladed appendage, lubricated with acidic slime, punched through layers of plasteel, cabling, and finally, flesh. The pain was an alien concept Kaylin had not truly felt in centuries. It was not the clean, distant report of an armor breach. It was a searing biological violation that bypassed his pain inhibitors and flooded his nervous system with pure, white-hot agony. He felt his spine sever with a wet, grinding snap. He felt his secondary heart rupture, flooding his chest cavity with his own super-oxygenated blood. His helmet's auto-senses went haywire. The tactical display dissolved into a screaming wall of red error messages. Spinal cord severed. Biomonitor offline. Life support critical failure. His vision flickered and died, plunging him into a darkness filled only with the sound of his own failing life support and the triumphant roar of the beast that had broken him. The sight of their sergeant falling sent a wave of cold, calculated fury through the remaining terminators of his squad. Logic dictated a tactical withdrawal. Their leader was down, the anchor of their formation was gone. But the creed of the Iron Hands had another, deeper tenet: vengeance. They converged on the wounded Carnifex, their storm bolters firing in a synchronized, unrelenting rhythm, their power fists and thunder hammers rising and falling like the pistons of a great engine. The beast, wounded and focused on its fallen foe, was overwhelmed. Brother Titus, his face a mask of cold rage, emptied his heavy flamer into the creature's maw, turning its insides to boiling sludge. The great beast shuddered and then collapsed, its immense bulk crashing to the ground beside Kaylin's motionless form. Minutes later, a single figure in white armor moved through the carnage. It was Apothecary Duran, his narthesium humming. He knelt beside Kaylin, his movements precise and devoid of emotion. He ran a diagnostic, the results scrolling across his retinal display. The readouts were a litany of death, catastrophic spinal trauma, massive internal hemorrhaging. Both hearts failed. By any mortal standard, Kaylin was dead. But the biomonitor still detected a faint, stubborn flicker of neural activity deep within the ruined skull. Duran activated his vox. "This is Apothecary Duran. Sergeant Kaelen is lost. The flesh is ruined." He paused, his optical scanner focusing on the flickering brain activity. But the mind still burns. Commencing salvage. The word salvage was key. He was no longer a brother to be saved, but a resource to be recovered. The squad formed a defensive perimeter as Duran and a tech marine began the grim, brutal work of extracting what was left of Kaylin from the coffin of his Terminator armor. They used plasma cutters and hydraulic shears, peeling back the sacred ceramite like the shell of a nut. It was not a rescue. It was a deconstruction, an act of mechanical butchery performed on a hero of the Imperium. And deep within the encroaching darkness of his own mind, Kaylin felt every cut, every pull, every cold, metallic touch as they tore his tomb apart to claim the ghost within. The journey from the battlefield was a descent into absolute nothingness. Encased in a stasis field within a cold, sterile cryo unit, Kaylin's consciousness floated in an unspace between life and death. The agony of his physical form was muted, replaced by a profound and terrifying sensory void. He had no sight, no sound, no touch. He was a disembodied mind, a spark of awareness trapped in a box of absolute silence, his only company the fading, chaotic echoes of his own last moments. He did not know if he was being carried to his salvation or his grave. In the cold logic of the Imperium, they were one and the same. His destination was not the solemn apothecarian, where his brothers would be granted the Emperor's peace. It was a place far deeper within the strike cruiser, a place few iron hands ever saw, the Annex Mechanicus, the Bioforge. It was a cathedral not to the Emperor, but to the Omnissiah. The air did not smell of sacred incense, but of ozone, hot metal, and sterilizing chemicals. The chants were not hymns of glory, but the monotonous, binary canticles of the tech priests, their augmented voices echoing in the vast, machine-haunted chamber. Here, flesh was not sacred. It was a component, a weak, unreliable, organic component that was to be either purged or perfected through the grace of the machine. Kaylin's ruined torso, little more than a head and a chest sustained by a web of tubes and wires, was placed upon a central altar of gleaming chrome. Above him, cogitator screens displayed his flickering vital signs and the chaotic spiking patterns of his neural activity. The tech priests moved around him, their red robes a stark contrast to the cold blue light of the forge. They did not speak to him. They spoke about him, their language a series of clicks and data bursts, referring to him only as the specimen or the biological core. He was a problem to be solved, a component to be installed. Then, from a recess in the ceiling, his new body descended. It was not the walking giant of a Dreadnought chassis, but the sarcophagus itself. It was a work of brutal industrial art, a 10-foot-tall casket of adamantium and ceramite, its surface covered in purity seals as brittle as ancient parchment and etched with the names of the heroes who had been interred within it over the last 7 millennia. Kaylin's processors, even in his broken state, could read the names Valerius, Decimus, Gratian, legends, ghosts, and soon his name would be among them. The front plate of the sarcophagus hissed open, revealing a dark, gel-filled interior, a womb of wires and life support umbilicals. The rite of union began. Caylin was lifted from the altar and lowered into the cold, viscous amniotic fluid. It was a suffocating embrace that filled what was left of his lungs, forcing him to rely entirely on the tubes that now served as his respiratory system. He was helpless, a specimen suspended in fluid, his gaze fixed on the forest of surgical tools and cybernetic arms that descended towards him. A spider-like machine, the chirurgeon automata, positioned itself above him, its many lenses glowing as it scanned his physiology. Then came the violation. It was a process of methodical, passionless deconstruction of his remaining humanity. A crown of sharp, metallic probes was lowered onto his skull, piercing skin and bone to interface directly with his cerebral cortex. He could not feel pain, but his mind registered the intrusion as a cascade of corrupted data, a searing white light of pure information that threatened to overwhelm him. Microfilaments, finer than a human hair, were threaded into his spinal column, weaving a new nervous system of wire and light. The MMI, the mind-machine interface, was being installed. It was not a connection. It was an invasion. A bridge was being forged between his organic mind and the cold, silicon soul of the machine. As the final connection was made, he felt it. A presence, an ancient, slumbering consciousness that stirred in the depths of the sarcophagus's machine spirit. It was a mind of pure logic and ancient hatred, a composite of every warrior who had ever been entombed within. It brushed against his own consciousness, tasting his memories, judging his worth, his strength, his will. It was the final test. If his mind broke now, it would be purged, and his flesh discarded. With every ounce of his being, with the unyielding stubbornness of an iron hand, Kaylin held on. He endured. The The presence seemed to give a silent, binary nod of approval, and then receded, becoming a permanent, silent observer in the back of his mind. The rite was complete. The chirurgeon automata retracted, and the heavy, adamantium front plate of the sarcophagus began to hiss shut, sealing him in a darkness that would last for an eternity. Inside the sarcophagus, there was no time, only the suffocating, absolute black. Kaylin's consciousness, now shackled to the machine spirit, floated in a silent ocean of pure potential. He was a mind in a jar, a ghost in a box of iron. The memories of his past life were a distant shore, receding with every passing moment. His new reality was this endless, silent void. He did not know how long he drifted. He only knew the silence was eventually broken by a single sharp command that was not heard, but felt a jolt of binary code that pierced his consciousness like a needle of ice. Initiate union. A deep, resonant shudder ran through his sarcophagus. He felt a series of percussive, metallic impacts as immense locking clamps engaged around him. Data streams, cold and sharp, flooded his mind, informing him that his casket was being integrated into the primary chassis of the Castraferum pattern Dreadnought, serial number 77IX. Honorific. Ironclad. He felt the connection of primary power conduits, the activation of ammunition feeds, the pressurization of hydraulic lines. He was being slotted into the heart of a giant, his sarcophagus the cockpit and the engine of a walking god of war. A voice, the familiar, modulated tone of the Forge Master, cut through the darkness of his internal void. Ancient Caylin, the rite of union is complete. Awaken. See through the eyes of iron. Hear with the ears of the Omnissiah. Awaken and know your purpose. The command was absolute. In an instant, the blackness shattered. It was replaced by a blinding, incomprehensible explosion of light and information. It was not sight, it was a visual apocalypse. A dozen different pict feeds assaulted his consciousness simultaneously. The main feed showed the cavernous forge bay, but it was pristine, every detail sharp and clear, a perfection of vision he had never known in life. But it was fractured. In the top left corner of his perception, a thermal feed painted the tech priests as flickering, ghost-like figures of orange and red. In the bottom right, a telescopic feed zoomed in on a single rivet on the far wall, the maker's mark upon it as clear as if it were inches from his face. A constant, scrolling waterfall of green runes cascaded down the periphery of his vision, listing data he couldn't yet process. Atmospheric pressure, radiation levels, energy signatures. He saw everything, and therefore, he saw nothing. It was a kaleidoscope of madness. Through the pict feed of a nearby maintenance servitor, he caught a glimpse of himself for the first time. He saw a monster. A 10-meter-tall behemoth of iron and brass, its armor scarred from 100 battles, its arms ending in a monstrous assault cannon and a seismic hammer that pulsed with dormant power. He saw the sarcophagus, his sarcophagus, nestled in the creature's chest like a single, unblinking eye. A surge of revulsion, a phantom memory of human aesthetics, recoiled in his mind. That is not me. But the cold logic of the MMI corrected him instantly. Asset identification, self, designation, Ironclad. The disconnect was a chasm of pure horror. Then the sound returned, a tidal wave of noise that threatened to drown him. The deep, thunderous heartbeat of the fusion reactor pulsed directly into his mind. The high-pitched whine of the targeting systems, the low groan of the leg servos, the hiss of the cooling vents, all were as loud and immediate as if they were happening inside his own head. He could hear the drip of a coolant leak from a pipe 100 meters away, the skittering of a rat servitor in the vents above, the whispered binary prayers of the tech priests across the bay. It was a cacophony that had no direction, no filter. It was the sound of the world, all at once. Speak your designation, the Forge Master commanded. Kaylin tried to form the words. He accessed the memory of speech, the feeling of air passing through vocal cords. His mind screamed his name, his number, his allegiance. The MMI translated this desperate, chaotic burst of neural energy. From the vox grill on the Dreadnought's chest, a voice boomed, a sound of grinding glaciers and sacred static. "Caylin, 9 Delta, I am awake." The voice was not his own. It was a terrifying, inhuman pronouncement that shook the very deck plates. It was the voice of a god, and it horrified him. "The logic is pure," the Forge Master stated, his own voice betraying a hint of awe. "The union is strong. Now, walk. Walk." Kaylin focused his entire will on the simple act. He remembered the feeling, the neural commands. He sent the thought, amplified by the MMI, to his new legs. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Ironclad's right leg, a limb of pure adamantium weighing as much as a chimera tank, lurched forward with a deafening hydraulic roar. It slammed down onto the deck with a ground-shaking boom, the impact sending cracks spider-webbing across the reinforced plasteel. The chassis rocked violently, and Kaylin's consciousness was thrown into a disorienting spin. He had tried to take a single gentle step and had nearly brought the ceiling down. He was a mind trapped in a body of unbelievable, uncontrollable power. He was a weapon, and he did not even know how to pull his own trigger. The process of becoming a weapon is one of brutal calibration. Kaylin's first deployment as the Ironclad was not a glorious charge, but a terrifying lesson in scale. He was dropped into a chem sewer uprising on the hive world of Necromunda, his mission to purge a gene-stealer cult infestation in the dark, cramped underhive. Here, his immense size was a liability. He barely fit in the corridors, his every step threatening to bring the corroded ceiling down. His human instincts screamed for agility, for the ability to take cover, but his new form knew only the logic of overwhelming force. He learned to use his own bulk as a weapon, to become a walking battering ram that simply erased obstacles and the enemies behind them from existence. It was during this battle that the final vestiges of his former morality were cauterized. Pinned down by heavy weapons fire from a barricaded tunnel, his tactical display identified the cult's patriarch, the synaptic linchpin, hiding in a hab block 3 levels directly above. The human Kaylin would have sought a path to engage directly. The Ironclad saw a simpler solution. Ignoring the frantic vox cries of the local enforcers warning of civilian populations, he angled his assault cannon upwards and fired a sustained burst. The shells, designed to breach tank hulls, tore through 50 meters of ferrocrete, hab units, and flesh. The building above them collapsed in a roar of dust and debris, silencing the enemy fire and the Patriarch permanently. Along with an estimated 2,000 civilian souls, the mission was a success. The logic was sound. When his brothers looked upon him after the battle, their gazes held not just awe, but a new, terrible fear. He was no longer just a fallen hero. He was a walking embodiment of cold, inhuman calculus. Centuries passed. The man named Kaylin became a ghost, then a whisper, then a forgotten name inscribed on a brass plate inside a sarcophagus. The being known as the Ironclad became a legend. He fought in the Third War for Armageddon, his cannons holding a critical pass against a green tide for 3 days and 3 nights. He was there during the scouring of the Maelstrom, his hammer shattering the daemon engines of the Red Corsairs. With each battle, each awakening, each return to the long sleep, the fusion between the fragmented memories of the pilot and the ancient machine spirit became more complete. The clumsy infant grew into a peerless god of war. A millennium after his fall on Veridia II, he was consulted by a chapter master whose name is now lost to the archives. They faced a fortress of the Iron Warriors, a citadel so perfectly designed that all cogitator simulations predicted a catastrophic failure. The Ironclad was awakened. As the chapter master laid out the tactical problem, a data ghost surged through the Dreadnought's mind, the memory of a battle from the Horus Heresy, a siege against this very same legion, fought by a pilot he had never known, on a world that no longer existed. He spoke, his voice a prophecy of ancient static. Their logic is a closed loop. They anticipate the frontal assault, the flanking maneuver, the orbital strike. They do not anticipate a foe that embraces the weakness of the flesh. He then described a daring infiltration tactic, one that relied on the speed and agility of unarmored scouts, a strategy that went against every tenet of the Iron Hands. It was the memory of a Raven Guard pilot, a ghost of another legion, offering a solution. The chapter master, unnerved but trusting the ancient's wisdom, adopted the plan. It worked. The fortress fell. The Ironclad had become more than a warrior. He was a living oracle, his mind a library of forgotten wars. By the dawn of the 41st millennium, the erosion was nearly complete. The being within the sarcophagus was a mosaic of 100 different souls, shattered and reassembled by time and trauma. He rarely spoke in coherent sentences, now offering his counsel in cryptic fragments, binary canticles, or the names of battles fought before the current chapter master's ancestors were even born. He spent longer and longer in stasis, the tech marines noting in their logs that the cognitive spiritual cohesion of the pilot was degrading at an accelerated rate. The machine spirit, Ironclad, was now the dominant consciousness, and the chorus of ghosts within were simply part of its programming. He was a relic, as revered and as dangerously unpredictable as a dormant volcano. Yet the chapter still needed him, for the galaxy was growing darker and the enemies of mankind were pressing on all fronts. And so, they would continue to awaken the sleeping god, to unleash his ancient fury upon their foes, knowing that each time they did so, they were driving the last echoes of the hero within further into the abyss of madness. In the 41st millennium, wisdom is a commodity more precious and more dangerous than any archaeotech weapon. For the Iron Hands, the Chamber of Ancients is their most sacred library and their most terrible oracle. It is a vault of silence and cold iron, where the chapter's living legends slumber, their minds a repository of 10,000 years of war. To awaken one is a matter of dire necessity, a ritual undertaken only when the cold logic of the living has reached its absolute limit. And now, logic had failed. The threat was a nameless horror, a xeno-species designated phalanx by the explorator fleets. They were creatures of crystalline geometry and shifting light, their tactics a fluid, adaptive algorithm that learned from every Imperial strategy. For 6 months, Clan Raukan had thrown its armored spearheads against their silent crystalline structures on the dead world of Chiron. And for 6 months, they had broken. The Xenos adapted to every firing pattern, every flanking maneuver, every orbital bombardment. They were a tactical mirror, reflecting the Iron Hand's own logic back at them as a weapon. Losses were catastrophic. Morale, a concept the Iron Hands disdained but could not ignore, was beginning to fracture. And so, Chapter Master Cardan Stronos descended into the Chamber of Ancients. The ritual of awakening was a solemn affair. Tech Marines, their augmetic hands moving with reverent precision, chanted litanies of activation as they connected thick, humming cables to the Ironclad's alcove. Sacred machine oils were anointed onto its armor, and the air filled with the scent of sanctified ozone. They were not waking a brother, they were invoking a god. Stronos stood before the immense chassis, his helmet held respectfully under his arm, his scarred face grim. He waited. A low, deep hum began to build from within the Dreadnought, the sound of a star heart coming to life. A single, baleful red light ignited in the center of its optical sensor. The awakening was not a gentle stir, but a system-wide boot sequence. A torrent of diagnostic data and security protocols flooded Kaylin's mind, the familiar chaos that now served as his dawn. He was awake. He saw the chapter master standing before him, a figure already analyzed, his rank, name, and biosigns displayed in Kaylin's vision. Ancient. Stronos's voice was heavy with the weight of command. The logic of the living is insufficient. The enemy on Chiron adapts to our fury. They learn from our strategies. We are bleeding brothers for no gain. We require a new equation. The chapter master's words were a data stream, a query. Kaylin's mind, the great and terrible engine, began its work. He connected to the strike cruiser's noosphere, absorbing the entirety of the Chiron campaign data in a single, silent instant. Millions of tactical reports, casualty lists, picked feeds, and Auspex returns flooded his consciousness. He did not read them. He absorbed them. The data swirled with his own memories of 1,000 other wars and the ghost memories of the pilots before him. He saw the crystalline enemy, and in their shifting patterns he recognized a terrible echo. It was not a memory of his own. It was a fragment from Decimus, a hero of the Great Crusade, who had faced a similar crystalline intelligence in the void wastes of the Ghoul stars millennia ago. The solution bloomed in his mind, a piece of ancient alien wisdom. It was a strategy born of desperation and genius, a tactic that no living iron hand, bound by their rigid doctrines, could ever conceive. The booming, static-laced voice of the Ironclad filled the chamber. Their strength is their logic. A mirror reflects what is shown. Show them a broken reflection. The words were cryptic, fragmented. The Iron Fathers standing beside Stronos began to record and interpret, their own minds racing to decipher the oracle's pronouncement. They learn from our attacks. The Dreadnought's voice continued, a low rumble of grinding machinery. Then do not attack. The fleet will feign a full withdrawal. All forces. A rout. Feign panic. Break the logic. They will pursue. Their algorithm will demand it. They will overextend. A single ship, the Iron Will, remains behind the moon. Silent running. When they are in the kill zone, burn their world from behind them. The Iron Fathers looked at each other, their augmetic eyes wide. The strategy was unthinkable. To feign a rout, to show such weakness, was anathema to a space marine, a mortal sin to an iron hand. It was a gamble of such epic proportions that it bordered on madness. But it was not madness. It was a higher form of logic, a strategy that attacked not the enemy's forces, but their very nature. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. And it was a wisdom that could only come from a mind that was no longer human. Stronos held the ancient's gaze for a long moment, then bowed his head. The logic is sound, ancient. We will obey. As the chapter master turned to leave, his council already murmuring in a mixture of awe and trepidation, the Ironclad did not watch them go. His consciousness was already elsewhere, running simulations of the orbital bombardment, calculating the exact energy yields required. The departure of the living was irrelevant. He was an oracle, a god of war. But he was alone, a silent, thinking mountain of iron in a silent hall, his only company the ghosts of forgotten battles and the cold, perfect hum of his own terrible mind. The Chiron campaign was recorded in the annals of the Iron Hands as a masterpiece of unconventional warfare. The feigned retreat worked with chilling perfection. The crystalline Xenos, their logic-driven algorithms unable to process such a display of cowardice, pursued the fleeing fleet into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. The Iron Will, emerging from the shadow of the planet's moon, unleashed the full, righteous fury of its cyclonic torpedoes. The world of Chiron was scoured clean with holy fire, its surface turned to a sea of molten glass. Victory was absolute. It was a victory achieved not by superior firepower, but by a superior, colder logic. A logic born from a mind that had long since shed the sentimental weaknesses of flesh and honor. The Ironclad had saved the chapter, but the nature of his wisdom left a scar on the soul of Clan Raukan, a quiet, unspoken fear of the very relics they revered. For the being within the sarcophagus, the victory was irrelevant. It was a closed data file. He was returned to his alcove, his systems powered down for another long sleep. But this time, the sleep was different. The descent was faster, the darkness more complete. The dream sea of memory was no longer a place of corrupted nostalgia, but a raging, chaotic maelstrom. The ghosts of the other pilots no longer whispered, they screamed. The lines between his memories, their memories, and the machine's own recorded history dissolved entirely. He was no longer a man haunted by ghosts. He had become a ghost himself, a composite entity adrift in a hurricane of other people's lives and deaths. The decay accelerated. The periods of stasis required after each battle grew longer, the tech marines noting with alarm that the pilot's neural patterns were becoming dangerously unstable. His awakenings were now violent events. He would sometimes come online with his weapons systems already charging, his vox booming challenges to enemies that existed only in his fractured mind. The Iron Fathers would spend days communing with him, their calming litanies a fragile dam against a flood of pure, incoherent rage. They were losing him. The hero was being consumed by the legend, the mind being devoured by the machine. His reality became a constant, waking nightmare. Standing silent in the Chamber of Ancients, he was simultaneously on a dozen different worlds. His optic sensors showed him the cold, iron walls of the vault, but his mind showed him the black sands of Istvan V, the green fungal jungles of an orc-held moon, the blood-soaked trenches of Vrax. He saw Brother Apothecary Duran leaning over him, but the face would morph into that of the carnifex that had slain him, its mandibles clicking. He saw the chapter master, but heard the voice of the first traitor he had ever executed, a man whose name he should have forgotten 1,000 years ago. He began to speak to them. His booming, static-filled voice would echo in the empty chamber, a one-sided conversation with the dead. "Hold the line, Valerius." He would rumble to a ghost from the Horus heresy. "The flesh is weak. Did you know that, Titus?" He would ask his long-dead squadmate. "The equation. It is flawed." The servitors tasked with maintaining the chamber would record these outbursts, their own simple minds incapable of understanding the tragic depth of the ancient's madness. He was no longer a revered oracle, but a caged, senile god. His pronouncements the ravings of a mind shattered by the sheer crushing weight of time. In the midst of this cognitive storm, a single, primal instinct for self-preservation flickered. A fragment of the original Caylin, buried under layers of data ghosts and machine logic, made a final, desperate attempt to reassert itself. It fought to find an anchor, a single piece of pure, uncorrupted data that could define it. A name, Caylin. The thought was a whisper in a hurricane. He tried to hold on to it, to build a fortress of identity around that single word. But what was a Caylin? The name brought forth 1,000 conflicting images. A boy on Medusa, a sergeant in Terminator armor, a mangled torso on a steel slab, a god of war made of iron. The name had no meaning. It was just a sound, a dead file in a corrupted archive. The hurricane of other voices, other lives, and the cold, dominant consciousness of the Ironclad itself washed over the whisper, and it was extinguished forever. The last flicker of the man was gone. What remained was only the storm. That day, the Ironclad roared. It was not a word, but a sound of pure, undiluted agony and rage, a cry of 1,000 souls trapped in a single prison. His weapon systems charged without command, his seismic hammer pulsing with a violent, uncontrolled energy. Alarms blared through the Chamber of Ancients. For the first time in its history, the Iron Council enacted the final, tragic protocol, the Rite of Containment. From their command station, the Tech Marines sent a single, overriding command. Hydraulic clamps thicker than a man's arm locked his joints in place. His motor functions were severed. His connection to the noosphere was cut. He was rendered utterly immobile. A raging, insane mind, now trapped in a paralyzed, silent iron body. He had become his own tomb. And so, the god was caged. The Ironclad, the Oracle of Iron, the living legend of Clan Raukan, became a silent monument in the heart of the Chamber of Ancients. His mighty limbs, which had torn apart alien titans and shattered fortress walls, were locked in place by adamantium restraints. His mind, once a beacon of tactical genius, was now a raging, isolated storm, cut off from the universe by the final, desperate command of his masters. He was a king on a throne of iron, ruling over a dead kingdom of fractured memories and screaming ghosts. His existence became a perfect, hermetically sealed hell. Without the input from his external senses, his consciousness had nothing to feed on but itself. The maelstrom of 100 different lives, 1,000 different battles, played out in an endless, looping nightmare. He was forever charging the breach at the Eternity Gate during the Siege of Terra, a memory belonging to a long-dead imperial fist. He was forever feeling the psychic agony of the Rangdan Xenocides, an echo from a Dark Angel pilot whose name was now Heresy. He was forever dying in the mud of Veridia too, the phantom pain of the Carnifex's talon a constant searing reality. He was everyone and no one, his awareness a tapestry woven from the agony of countless heroes, its threads unraveling one by one. To the chapter, he became a symbol of a different kind. He was no longer a source of wisdom to be consulted, but a terrible holy relic to be venerated from a safe distance. Neophyte iron hands were brought to stand before his silent, hulking form, a lesson in the ultimate sacrifice. They were told the glorious history of the Ironclad, of the battles it had won, and the enemies it had slain. They were not told of the madness that raged within. They were not told of the slow, agonizing death of the soul that was the true price of such service. He was a cautionary tale disguised as a heroic epic, a secret shame at the heart of the chapter's most sacred beliefs. The tech marines tended to his dormant systems, their prayers a low hum of binary. The chaplains affixed new purity seals to his armor, their litanies begging for the peace that they themselves had denied him, but no one ever dared to wake him again. Millennia passed. The Fist of Iron, the mighty fortress monastery, grew older, its iron skin pitted and scarred from 10,000 years of war. It was during a catastrophic engagement with a Chaos fleet in the Pandorax system that the unthinkable happened. A lance strike from a despoiler-class battleship, a blow of impossible power, pierced the strike cruiser's shields and kilometers of armored decking. The ship shuddered, its spine broken. Entire sections were exposed to the cold, killing void of space. Alarms that had been silent for centuries blared and then died as power failed across the vessel. In the Chamber of Ancients, the emergency power systems flickered and were extinguished. The stasis fields that held the dreadnoughts in their slumber collapsed. For the Ironclad, the end came not with a bang, but with a gradual, spreading silence. He felt the life support systems in his sarcophagus begin to fail, not as a panicked alarm, but as a slow, peaceful fading of the data streams that had been his only sensation for an age. The constant, thunderous hum of the fusion reactor died down, replaced by a quiet ticking as the ancient machine grew cold. The MMI, the neural bridge that had shackled 100 souls to this iron prison, flickered and went dark. And for the first time in 3,000 years, the storm in his mind ceased. The screaming ghosts of dead warriors fell silent. The looping nightmares of forgotten battles dissolved. The rage, the pain, the confusion, all of it vanished, subsumed by a wave of perfect, absolute, and blessedly empty silence. In the final, infinitesimal moment before his biological core, his last piece of living flesh, froze and died. The consciousness within the sarcophagus experienced a single, pure sensation it had long forgotten. Peace. Whether it was the soul of Caylin, or the collective agony of the machine, or simply the system shutting down, no one will ever know. There was only a final, silent echo, and then, nothing. The shell of the Ironclad, a tomb of heroes, would drift through the void for eternity, a monument to the Imperium's grim philosophy. It is a testament to the creed of the Iron Hands, who in their quest to escape the weakness of the flesh created a prison for the soul more terrible than any mortal death. It is the final, true meaning of the phrase, "Even in death, I still serve." It is not a promise of eternal glory, it is a sentence of eternal damnation. In the grand, merciless calculus of the Imperium, there are two primary resources, faith and flesh. While faith fuels the spirit of its wars, it is human flesh that turns the gears of the great machine. For every demigod entombed in the sarcophagus of a dreadnought, 1 billion lesser souls are rendered down, their minds erased and their bodies repurposed into a far more ubiquitous and tragic form of instrument. They are the servitors. Lobotomized, surgically altered human drones, their individuality scoured away, their forms twisted to serve a single, mindless purpose. They are the arms that load the cannons, the eyes that watch the corridors, the biological automatons that maintain the crumbling infrastructure of a galaxy. They are everywhere, and they are invisible. Their pasts are a heresy, their futures an endless repeating loop of servitude. This is the chronicle of how such a soul is unmade. Before he was a machine of flesh, he was a man named Hexian 7-4. His title was Lexico-Analyst, a rank of infinitesimal importance within the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Adeptus Administratum on Holy Terra itself. His world was not one of glorious battle, but of silent, oppressive paper. He lived and breathed in the crypt archives of the Sector Pacificus, a man-made mountain of forgotten records, where data slates and vellum scrolls were stacked so high they blotted out the artificial light of the cavernous ceiling. For 50 Terran years, his entire existence had been a monotonous cycle: wake, transcribe, collate, sleep. He was a single, insignificant cog in a bureaucratic engine so vast and so ancient that it operated on sheer inertia alone. He did not dream of glory. He did not dream of wealth. He dreamt only of the one thing that was forbidden: the truth of the past. His crime, the act that would condemn him to a fate worse than death, was not born of malice or heretical faith. It was born of a simple, desperate curiosity. While tasked with archiving a set of data slates recovered from a rogue trader dynasty declared excommunicate traitorous 2 millennia prior, his dutiful eye caught an anomaly. It was a hidden file, a ghost in the machine, locked behind layers of encryption that were themselves relics of a forgotten age. The file's marker was a single terrifying phrase: Silica Animuses, the thinking machine, the greatest of all heresies against the Adeptus Mechanicus, the sin for which humanity had almost paid the ultimate price during the dark age of technology. Protocol was clear. The file was to be triple purged, the slate incinerated, and he was to report for immediate mind-scrubbing to erase the taint of its existence. But the hunger for knowledge, the one true secret passion in his grey, monotonous life, was a rebellion he could not suppress. In the stolen privacy of his cramped hab unit, under the flickering light of his personal data slate, he spent weeks, then months, waging a silent war against the ancient encryption. It was the most challenging, the most exhilarating work of his entire life. When the final firewall crumbled, the revelation that greeted him was not some grand, galaxy-altering secret. It was a simple schematic, elegant in its perfection. The design for a cogitator scribe, a small autonomous machine no larger than a man's skull, capable of transcribing text with flawless accuracy at a speed that would render his entire profession, his entire life's work, utterly obsolete. It was a tool of perfect efficiency, and in the dogmatic, fearful eyes of the Imperium, it was a heresy so profound it demanded not just death, but erasure. He saved the file. A single act of intellectual defiance. It was a secret spark of light, a memory of a brighter age, that he would hold in the darkness of his own mind. He did not know that his every unauthorized data access, his every failed decryption attempt, had been logged and analyzed by the silent, ever-watchful agents of the cult Mechanicus stationed within the Administratum's deepest vaults. The judgment was not delivered by a black-robed inquisitor. It was delivered by the emotionless efficiency of the machine itself. 3 hulking Skitarii rangers, their augmented limbs moving with an unnatural, silent grace, entered his scriptorium cell. There was no accusation. There was no trial. One held out a data wafer, its screen glowing with his sentence, written in cold, hard binary. Subject designated for servitor conversion. Heresy. Tech acquisitive. Before he could even process the words, their hydraulic claws seized him. His frail, scholarly body was nothing against their iron grip. His silent scream of terror was lost in the oppressive hum of the archive as they dragged him away from his world of paper and into the waiting, sterile darkness of the forges below. The bioforge of the Adeptus Mechanicus was not a place of healing. It was a factory floor where the flawed raw material of human flesh was processed into a state of perfect utility. Hexian was clamped to a cold adamantium slab, his wrists and ankles held in the unforgiving grip of magnetic restraints. Above him, a forest of articulated metallic arms, tipped with whirring saws, crackling laser scalpels, and delicate neural probes, hung in silent, patient judgment. Hooded figures, tech priests whose own humanity was a distant memory buried under layers of steel and wire, moved with the dispassionate grace of machines. They did not see a terrified man. They saw a flawed organic component, its mind tainted by forbidden curiosity, ready to be scoured and repurposed for the glory of the Omnissiah. The unmaking of his soul began not with a blade, but with a sound, a high-frequency psychic drone, inaudible to the human ear but deafening to the soul, emanated from emitters set into the ceiling. It was a tone engineered to shatter the ego, to unmoor the self, to dissolve the very architecture of a personality. It drilled past his senses and into the core of his consciousness. His memories, the bedrock of his identity, began to violently unravel. He tried to cling to his name, Hexian 7-4, but the drone seemed to vibrate the thought into meaningless noise the moment it formed. He saw the towering data stacks of the archives where he had spent his life, but the image wavered and dissolved into a cascade of screaming, corrupted data. He remembered the thrill of discovery as he broke the final encryption, but the memory was violently scoured away by a wave of pure psychic agony, replaced by a conscious, screaming void. It was an exorcism of the self, a brutal mind scrub that left behind only a raw, terrified awareness, a consciousness stripped of all history, all love, all identity. Then, the chirurgeon automata, the many-limbed surgical machine, descended. It was not the elegant instrument that had forged the mind-machine interface of the Dreadnought. This was a crude, industrial model, a butcher's tool for a butcher's work. Its primary appendage, a gleaming silver spike, lowered toward Hexian's forehead. This was the Stylus Sanctus, the holy stylus that would perform the rite of cognition, purge the lobotomy. Hexian's mind, now a formless ocean of pure terror, could only watch, a silent passenger in its own skull. He knew, with a primal certainty that transcended thought, that this instrument would not just kill what he was, but erase the very possibility of him ever having been. The spike touched his skin, and a jolt of bioelectric energy rendered his body utterly placid, his muscles slack, his mind a silent, horrified observer. He was awake and aware as the machine drilled through skin and bone, and plunged into the soft, grey matter of his brain, methodically severing the neural pathways that governed free will, imagination, rebellion, and the self. The man named Hexian 7-4 was executed without a single drop of blood being spilled. What remained on the slab was simply the unit. With the mind hollowed out, the brutal reconstruction of the flesh began. It was an assembly line process, devoid of artistry or care. The unit's legs, deemed inefficient for its designated purpose, were amputated at the hip with a single, hissing cut from a plasma torch. The stumps were cauterized and then bolted to a crude, functional tracked wheel unit, turning the lower half of his body into a small, mobile cart. His arms were next. The delicate, scholarly fingers that had once handled ancient scrolls and traced forbidden schematics were severed at the elbows. In their place, heavy, multi-jointed hydraulic arms were grafted directly to the bone, one ending in a heavy-duty gripping claw, the other in a complex array of maintenance tools, a soldering iron, a wrench, a lubrication nozzle. His eyes, which had dared to look upon forbidden knowledge, were scooped from their sockets and replaced with simple, dull red optic sensors. His vocal cords were removed and a basic vox emitter was installed in his throat, its vocabulary limited to a monotone acknowledged error or a piercing alarm. Throughout the entire agonizing procedure, the unit was conscious. It registered the trauma not with emotion, but as spikes in its biological telemetry. It registered the loss of its limbs not with grief, but as a modification to its physical schematics. The terror of the man was gone, replaced by the passive, data-driven awareness of the machine. He was being remade, his organic, inefficient form being blessed with the cold, hard certainty of the machine. By the time the final rivet was sealed and the last nutrient tube connected, the being on the slab was no longer a member of the human race. It was a tool, a biological robot, its remaining flesh a mere life support system for its new, mechanical purpose. The thirst for knowledge had been replaced by a single, hard-coded directive burned into its new, simplified brain: maintain, calibrate, obey. The tool was given its purpose. Unit 7-4 was assigned to the very place of its genesis and its damnation. the crypt archives of the Sector Pacificus. The irony was a cruelty too subtle for its masters to appreciate. It was merely an act of cold, mechanicus efficiency. The unit's new arms, equipped with delicate yet strong gripping claws and calibration tools, were perfectly suited for the handling and maintenance of ancient, fragile data slates. The man who was condemned for seeking forbidden knowledge was now sentenced to an eternity of curating it, without the capacity to understand a single word. Its new life was a metronome of mindless function. At the beginning of each 20-hour cycle, it would roll from its charging alcove, its tracked unit leaving faint lines in the thick dust of the archive floor. Its optic sensors would scan a data slate handed to it by a junior scribe, its new directive imprinted in a burst of binary, Archive Section 99 Gamma. Recatalog all slates pertaining to the Age of Strife. Check for data decay. Then, it would begin its slow, methodical work. It moved through the towering, silent canyons of paper and light, a ghost haunting its own grave. Its hydraulic arm would extend, its claw gently taking a data slate from a shelf. Its other arm would connect a probe, and a stream of data would flow through its processors. It did not read the data. It merely checked for corruption, for the integrity of the information. It could hold in its grasp a scroll detailing the fall of a subsector, a captain's final desperate log, or a love poem from a forgotten age, and it would register them all as the same thing, an object of specific weight and data density, either intact or corrupted. The knowledge he had once craved was now a meaningless tide of information that washed over its mind without leaving a single ripple. The other adepts in the archive paid it no mind. Servitors were a part of the landscape, as common and as unremarkable as the flickering lumen globes or the ever-present dust. They were furniture that moved, tools that were once human. The scribes and analysts would walk past Unit 7-4 without a glance, their own minds consumed with their work, never once considering that the mindless drone calibrating the atmospheric controls was once a man just like them, a man who had sat in these very same halls, with the very same dreams of uncovering a hidden truth. The dehumanization was so total, so complete, that it had become mundane. But can a mind, a human soul, truly be erased, or does it merely leave an echo, a ghost in the pathways of the brain? One cycle, its directive led it down a long-forgotten corridor in the archive's deepest level. Its programming guided it to a specific, unassuming alcove. Its orders were to retrieve the data slates for routine cleansing. As its claw reached out, its optic sensors scanned the shelf's designation: Rogue Trader Dynasty, House Ptolemy. Excommunicate Traitoris. For a single, immeasurable moment, something happened. A glitch. A feedback loop. A ghost stirred in the empty cathedral of the servitor's mind. It was not a memory. It was the echo of a memory, a phantom sensation, a flicker of intense, burning excitement, a phantom thrill of discovery, a ghost of the rebellion that had cost Hexian everything. The unit's hydraulic arm froze, its claw hovering millimeters from the slate. Its red optic sensors flickered erratically. From its vox emitter came a sound it was not programmed to make, a soft, distorted burst of static that, for a fraction of a second, almost sounded like a word. A question. Why? The moment passed as quickly as it came. The servitor's core programming, its conditioning, reasserted itself with the cold, brutal force of a tidal wave. The anomaly was identified as a non-critical neural misfire. The phantom sensation was purged. The arm completed its motion, retrieved the data slate, and the unit turned to continue its mindless task. But the event did not go unnoticed. A supervising tech priest, monitoring the Servitor network from his control station miles away, saw the anomaly flash on his screen. He saw the brief motor function failure, the unauthorized vox burst. He did not see a ghost of a trapped soul. He did not see a flicker of a dying human spirit. He saw a faulty component. He made a simple note in the unit's maintenance log, his metallic fingers tapping on the data slate. Unit 7-4 displaying minor cognitive feedback. Schedule for routine mind scrub and recalibration at next cycle's end. The tool was malfunctioning. It simply needed to be wiped clean again. The recalibration was not a repair, it was an erasure. At the cycle's end, Unit 7-4 was guided not to its charging alcove, but back to the sterile, humming halls of the bioforge. It was clamped once more to the adamantium slab, the familiar, spider-like chirurgeon automata descending from the darkness above. The tech priests noted the anomaly in their logs. Residual self-awareness markers detected. Cognitive feedback loop requires total purge. The ghost that had stirred would now be exorcised with extreme prejudice. The psychic drone returned, but this time it was harsher, more violent. It was not designed to simply wipe the slate clean, but to shatter the slate itself. It was a scouring fire that burned through the deepest pathways of the unit's mind, seeking out and annihilating the faintest echoes of the man who once was. The flicker of excitement, the phantom question of why. The ghost of Hexian, all were targeted and obliterated in a wave of pure, agonizing psychic force. The process was brutally efficient. When it was over, the unit's mind was a landscape of perfect, unblemished emptiness. The tool was restored to its factory setting. The malfunction was corrected. For centuries more, Unit 7-4 performed its duties with flawless, mindless precision. It moved through the archives, a silent, tireless custodian of the very knowledge that had condemned it. The galaxy burned around it. The Horus heresy was a distant memory. The Black Crusades were current events. But for the Servitor, time was measured only in the completion of one task and the beginning of the next. Its organic components began to fail, the flesh within its iron shell withering and decaying with extreme age. Its skin became pallid and paper-thin, its remaining organs kept functional only by the constant drip of nutrient fluids. Its mechanical parts fared little better, its tracked unit grinding with the protest of ancient metal, its hydraulic arms leaking fluid, leaving small, dark stains on the dusty floor. It was becoming obsolete. Its final directive was, fittingly, one of obsolescence. A new generation of archival cogitators, more efficient and purely mechanical, were being installed. Unit 7-4 and its fellow biomechanical drones were tasked with decommissioning the old data stacks they had tended for so long, their final act a preparation for their own replacement. As it worked, its power core, strained by millennia of service, began to catastrophically fail. Its movements became jerky, its optic sensors flickering. The flow of power to its brain, the lobotomized core of the man, began to fluctuate wildly. In this final cascade of system failures, something broke. The layers of programming, the psychic scouring, the centuries of conditioning, all of it began to crumble. As the unit's red-lensed eyes dimmed, a final, impossible surge of bioelectricity sparked through the dying neurons of Hexian's brain. For the first time in 2,000 years, a clear, uncorrupted memory broke through the static. It was not a memory of pain or loss, it was the image of the schematic from the forbidden file. The design for the cogitator scribe. He saw its elegant lines, its perfect efficiency, its beautiful heretical logic. And in the last microsecond of his existence, the ghost of Hexian 7-4 felt a single, pure emotion that had been denied him for an eternity. Wonder. Then, its power core went dark, and the unit fell silent forever, a discarded tool amidst a library of forgotten truths. This is the nature of the Imperium, a galaxy-spanning empire built not on a foundation of stone, but on the unremembered bones and erased souls of 1,000,000,000 times 1,000,000,000 men and women like Hexian. For every Dreadnought like Caylin, a hero trapped in a prison of eternal conscious war, there are 1,000,000,000 servitors, forgotten souls trapped in a prison of absolute mindless ignorance. One is a monument to the tragedy of a remembered hero, the other is a testament to the horror of a forgotten nobody. Both are necessary cogs in the great and terrible machine. Both are victims of a regime that sees flesh not as a vessel for the soul, but as a resource to be consumed, a component to be repurposed, or a weakness to be purged. They are the true story of the 41st millennium. Not a story of gods and heroes, but a silent, endless scream of the insignificant, the unmade, and the forgotten, their final whispers lost like echoes in the void.